To trope or not to trope? That is the question. And whether you choose to behold its merits, align its purpose, or disavow its petulance and codify its moroseness, one will be drawn for all time. Conversations will be had, and its sacred keeper, the one AF Stewart, may reside over this procedure, but make no mistake, it is you, the Horde, playing judge, jury, and executioner. And while civil tongues will prevail, the question remains, even if sullen by blood, is it time to answer the call? To trope or not to trope?
Okay, welcome back to another episode of Trope or Not to Trope. And tonight's guest is SM Hillman, also known as Sean. We are here to debate the magical artifact trope. Now, what is the magical artifact trope, you ask, or don't ask? It is basically when you have a magical artifact in a fantasy, usually a fantasy book, it sometimes crosses over into horror and a little into sci-fi occasionally. So think Lord of the Rings, The One Ring, think Excalibur, King Arthur, and things like that. Now I'm going to turn it over to Sean, let him introduce himself and tell us all why he is arguing against magical artifacts. So take it away, Sean.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. I'm SM Hillman, or just call me Sean, speculative fiction writer. And although there are a couple of magical artifacts that I love, Stormbringer and the Elric's story being the one I think of most. The fact is, I think magical artifacts in writing and in role-playing games are not necessarily good ideas all the time. And there's 4 reasons I have in particular. The first reason, or the first argument I have, is that it's a character that lacks agency, right? The artifacts are often written, not always, but often written as if they're a character unto themselves. But they lack agency, even though they are talked about and acted upon. They're really very passive characters, extremely passive aspects of the thing. Case in point, Dorothy's silver slippers or silver shoes from Baum's the one from Wizard of Oz, which are turned into ruby slippers in the movie. The slippers, ironically, have less power than the One Ring, which doesn't really showcase itself very much in the story. So that's my first thing. They're often not talked about, acted upon, but don't have much agency in themselves. We're told that the ring wants to get back to Sauron, but really all it does is sort of lay there and whisper at you. I feel like it's a little bit lazy writing because, again, the artifacts don't have much to do, right? And their origins are usually exposition. You don't often see the artifact being created. You often don't see the passions poured into its creation or the reasons for its creation. You get it in a lore dump, which is kind of boring, and I think understates the importance of this particular artifact. And thirdly, they are ultimate weapons. In a lot of ways, they can destroy the world, right? That's not always, but they are often world-threatening or civilization-threatening weapons. But they're not treated that way in the stories. In our world, we have a lot of very powerful weapons, but we have atomic weapons, nuclear weapons, as they're more commonly called now. And it's noted that other than nuclear testing, or should be noted that other than nuclear testing, even the people who are bad guys or who are um, willing to do terrible things, none of them have, not since the bombs in that the United States dropped on Japan at the end of the Second World War, atomic weapons haven't been used by anyone in anger. Whereas in fantasy stories, you will see that the person with magical artifacts, good or bad, is more than willing to use them. And I don't think that's necessarily realistic because these are not stupid people, and they would have the same um, trepidation upon unleashing such a powerful weapon or artifact. I mean, it could be for good as well, upon the world as the people as we do today. And so those are the big three that really bother me about it. That even though that our magical artifacts are considered um, uh, powerful, they're just really inert, often passive. Don't have a lot to do except be acted upon. And honestly, it's a sort of a lazy button. You find this more in sort of pulp writing, I think, or I'll say game adjacent fiction, where someone with a potion of healing or uh, a which is not quite an artifact, right? That's kind of a low level thing. Or a magic sword, for instance, will become an unstoppable killing machine, which it just seems they can still be an unstoppable killing machine even if they don't have the magic doodad. So it's sort of extraneous and kind of an easy that easy button. Staples, right? Staples has easy button. You push the easy button, magical sword or magical staff. So those are my basics. Those are my throw down the gauntlet ideas.
Okay, so well, all good points, and yeah, I mean, I've seen different stories and things um, misuse magical artifacts, and they can be a crutch for upping the stakes too fast and not be realistic. But I would say that they are, in fact, very much a fantasy staple, and are used, and their use is to be a catalyst for the plot, not to be a character. It's like, I mean, if you take Lord of the Rings, without the One Ring, there would be no story. They would have nothing to do. The hobbits would still be in Hobbiton, and the dwarf would still be wherever the dwarf was, the elf, whatever. Yeah. So I mean, they'd have absolutely nothing to do if they weren't taking the One Ring to Mount Doom. So magical artifacts are to be a catalyst, and I would also say that they're very versatile things. They don't necessarily have to be world threatening. They can be aids. They can be like with the librarians. If you've ever watched the librarians show on TV, um, magic artifacts are basically the whole idea of that show, and the previous show and the current one, the next chapter. And they're not being misused per se. I mean, sometimes they're falling into the hands of people who don't know how to use them, so they're causing trouble that way. But also, the magic is so wild and unpredictable that it does things on its own occasionally, and they have to tame it in and get a hold of it like that. So it can be used in that form as well. So it can be a threatening or a world threatening event without actually having someone behind it.
Sure.
Your thought?
Yep. So yeah, I think that's probably true. Um, but again, what is what is the purpose, or what is the artifact's purpose in um, its power? Right? It's a powerful thing that when not controlled properly. But who would number one, who would create something like that? Well, okay, people do create things like that. But right. Um, but it's not that entertaining to me in that regard, um, without some larger force behind it. Just the artifacts by themselves could easily be people or other characters who, I mean, there could be a character with those powers, but it has more agency than the artifact does, right? Artifacts are often just passed around, or they glow and they're very menacing, or they glow and they make people happy. But they're still very passive. And I think that as a trope, I don't necessarily like passive tropes. And I think the artifacts generally are pretty passive. Now, um, to some degree, I think it's a good point. Without the One Ring, the story doesn't work. But maybe that's as much as I admire the writing. But maybe that's um, a critique of the story itself. It's like, what could you do? What could J.R.R. Tolkien have done with the story to make it work without the One Ring? With the One Ring just being something, one of many potential points of conflict within the story, right? And it does. It overrides everything. But I think, yes, it does act as a catalyst for the forces of good to move. But without that catalyst, the forces of evil, um, sans Sauron, obviously, um, may have just all gotten together and whooped up on the forces of good. And there wouldn't have been that, without the One Ring, there's nothing to bring them together. So I think, to some degree, you're correct. It acts as a catalyst, and without the One Ring, there's no story. But I don't necessarily think that's a good thing, right? I think the story should um, stand on its own without the magical artifact.
Yeah, but you could also, if we're keeping with the One Ring, you could also say that the One Ring was an allegory or a symbol, and it gave the book a deeper meaning that way.
Sure,
Thoughts?
absolutely. I think I'd have to agree with that, right? The One Ring is an allegory for for the seductive nature of evil, maybe for power that it gives you. Certainly, I think we can witness that today, that people are easily seduced to the dark side, even without cookies. Um, and I think that's true. That's a good point, because I mean, and I think we can agree that some magical artifacts are turn out better, or more integral to their stories and are better done than others. Um, as you know, I do have criticisms about it, but the One Ring does bring the story together, in that regard, for sure.
Okay, so another point that I have is that magical artifacts can also be used, especially if you're doing like recently I did paranormal cozy mystery, and I've used a couple of magic artifacts as kind of MacGuffins and red herrings to distract the reader to make them keep them guessing. So, what are your thoughts on that?
So obviously they're good at that, right? That it does keep the reader, or does give the reader as well as the character something to focus on, right? Oh, the necklace of such and such, or a ring. Those are good ones. Um, a particular token from a cultural token, perhaps. Um, and I think you see the same thing, right, in non-paranormal, non-magical, like a cozy mystery where some jewels are stolen, right? That kind of that kind of brings out the sordid underbelly, or whatever part of the mystery. Um, and I think too, um, but again, I think I come back to the fact that the items are something that are acted upon and don't have as much agency, and they still don't. That makes them a little less interesting. If the particular magical artifact had a little more agency, could choose its person, that might make them more interesting, right? It suddenly appears in Bob's um, basement. Bob can't seem to get rid of the thing. It's obviously choosing Bob. Um, then that might make it a more interesting um, part of the story. But if it's just something to be stolen, if it's just something to get lost, I don't think that necessarily makes it make. I mean, you could find something. It could be a cat, right? You could easily use a cat. People love cats. Cozy paranormal mysteries. Somebody's cat is missing, and the cat would have more agency than a missing necklace or picture frame, for instance.
Yeah, but I know there are um, magical artifacts that do have some agency. I mean, the Dresden Files comes to mind, and Bob the Skull. I think that's Bob. His name is
It
Bob.
is fun. Yeah,
Yeah. So I mean, that's. I mean, technically, I mean, he is kind of alive, but I mean, it's technically a magical artifact though as well. So I mean, there have been done, and you've got sentient things like my Excalibur is sort of sentient in the book I'm writing.
right.
So you do, and like again with the librarians, their Excalibur was definitely a sentient magical artifact, um, kind of like a puppy.
Well,
That's kind of how they treated that particular object when they used it in the show. It was like a little puppy.
gotcha. Um, so I think that I feel like that proves my point, right? You to make the magical artifact more interesting, to give it some momentum of its own, you have to work hard at that, right? You have to give it maybe sentience, right? Like you're talking about. Give it purpose outside of the purpose of the other characters. Maybe even give it a point of view or a voice. I mean, everybody loves the voice, right? When a magical artifact can talk to you, and is usually sardonic or has some sort of personality to it.
Yeah.
That makes it much more of a well-rounded character, right? But that's rare and rarely well done, I think. Um, Certainly, though, that does make it, and so um, I think Bob is a great example of I would consider that a magical artifact, right? Because even though it was once a person, it is now just a skull with its own, but retains its own, some of its own abilities, right, and things like that, that it uses for its own, that it chooses to use, whereas just a magical Excalibur, say in sentience or anything, just a symbol, it's symbolic, sure, but you can't make it do anything. Um, it can only do what other people do with it, right? It's completely at the whim of the other characters.
Yeah. I would say that magical artifacts with agency do tend to pop up in fairy tales, perhaps more than fantasy, because you have things like Snow White's Evil Queen's magic mirror,
Hmm.
and there are other certain artifacts in fairy tales that do have some sort of agency or some sort of sentience as well. So there is that. But
Agreed.
yeah, and I would also say though that there are some subgenres in fantasy where the magical artifact is almost key to it. Things like the treasure hunt or the fantasy thief scenario or the fantasy quest scenario. Quite often, the magical artifact is like the Holy Grail,
Right.
the
Yes.
actual and figurative Holy Grail that the characters are looking for. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, first, I think Quest again is something. I think Quest fantasy, Quest fiction has to be done well to be interesting. Um, it isn't that I won't read one that's not done well, right? You reread to enjoy as well, but with a critical eye, I feel like the Quest has to be something more. Um, there has to be more to it, right? And I think there has to be a more complex item, um, or artifact, what we're talking about here, to make it worth the effort. Um, so I'll give you an example of one that I think is used pretty well, but as an example versus ones that are not. And I know not everybody loves this movie, but Kroll, I love Kroll. The quest is to save the queen, and along the way, he has to pick up the glaive, which is not a glaive; it's a spinning doodad. Um, but which is a completely, that's a
Yeah,
completely different show, right?
I
Yeah,
know that there's this video channel on YouTube I watch where the whole glaive thing's been a thing, so that's why I was laughing. Yeah.
yeah. But I feel like that that you can tell that the glaive has a little bit of agency, right? And but it's not. It's a means to an end. It is not the end itself. The end, the quest is to save the princess, which again is its own trope that we can talk about. Um, but that's why I think it's done well. But often you won't see that, right? It'll um, okay, I'll give you one that's done well, and I love this movie. It's called The Sword and the Sorcerer. It's with Lee Horsley, and Richard Lynch. It's as bad as you think, but I love it. But the sword in the title is like it can shoot off its blade. It's got three blades. It can shoot two of them off. But at the end of the day, the sword really isn't necessary, right? It could be any sword. It could be an axe. It could be anything. It doesn't, even though it's in the title, even though it's featured, it doesn't add anything to the story, really. But then neither does Lee Horsley, so I guess maybe that's me being unfair. So.
Okay, so Faye here had a good observation that the Jumanji game has some sentience, which is an interesting point.
And yeah, I agree. That is a good point. It undercuts the entire premise, doesn't it? I mean, obviously, all stories are human stories, but in that case, the game, I think that's particularly well done because the game acts as a foundation for the entire story, which I think it does pretty well.
Yes, and it may actually be evil. We haven't quite decided on that yet.
Yeah, at the very least, it's capricious, right?
Yes,
It's a bit of a trickster god. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. So, I would also say that a magical artifact. Well, like just before I go on to that, I just forgot one point. It's like you were talking about that the quest fantasy has to have different stakes, but I would say that the magical artifact that they're questing for can actually help character development, because each one of the fantasy questers can have a different reason for going after the artifact. So you can actually do various interesting things with character development based on their reasoning for the quest.
Right, and the stronger the artifact, or the more agency is the word I'm using, but um, the more that the artifact has to offer is more maybe multifaceted is the way, right? The fact that it can handle various reasons. I want to heal the world, or I just want to have it to have it, or I want to be the one to get it, right? It could just be prestige, but that's a magical artifact that, although again, it's people mostly acting upon it, still, like you say, still provides a large a spectrum of reasons to go after it, and not just a simple one way. Yeah.
Okay, so Joe says, case in point, the Infinity Stones. I actually have a point about the Infinity Stones. So we'll go to that one, which is it says that artifacts can make an excellent external threat. And with, as you mentioned earlier, with world-ending stakes, examples the Infinity Stones.
Yeah, it's a good one.
So that's the thing. I mean, and you made the point that why would the villain use it? A lot of times the villain uses it, but it gets out of his control. Like he thinks he can control it, but he can't. That's also unstable. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, and I think that the Infinity Stones is a great example. I'm glad you brought it up. Couple things. Number one, yes, obviously there's the law of unintended consequences, which can make a magical, in the case of a magical artifact, can make it more interesting when, even if it is sort of like passive, people have to use it. It can't really do things on itself. Um, that that can make the whole story more interesting when the person who does use it does so and doesn't quite understand what's happening, and that could be a villain or a hero, right? A protagonist or an antagonist in a story. Even the protagonist can use uh, uh, the item and not realize what it's going to do. The one Mickey Mouse animated where he's using the broom and some other magic. I don't remember the name of it.
The Sorcerer's Apprentice.
Yes, the Sorcerer's Apprentice, right? And then suddenly, everything goes awry in the the sorcerer's antechamber. But the Infinity Stones, I think, are an example of devaluing of the magical artifact, which can also happen, which really makes it, um, to me, less. You looking back, it's like, oh, didn't have the um, uh, impact that in the long run it didn't have the impact that it did, because subsequent media um, showed that, like the time people had a bunch of Infinity Stones in their drawers, right, in their office drawers. Um, the fact that you could, like, anybody can make an Infinity Gauntlet. Well, okay, not anybody, but if you're a billionaire, you can make an Infinity Gauntlet. Um, just seemed. Uh, and I think it's also one of those things. Whereas once you've hooked your story to the Infinity Gauntlet, I think it makes for a way less interesting story. Like Infinity War is a better movie than Endgame, even though Endgame has a lot of emotional stuff at the end, which is good. But the underlying shenanigans time shenanigans to go through didn't interest me that much. Right? It felt very forced, um, and because there wasn't much of a story left to tell without the Infinity Gauntlets, which I think is another negative. Right? If it's the only um, if it's the only story in town by itself, a magical artifact, I don't think is that interesting.
Yeah, well, time travel shenanigans are a whole other trope. We got
Right, again.
for next season. Okay, so we have a comment here. The artifact in my book is the catalyst to undo the damage, which was an insurrection, by using it to find the lost information of how the insurrection happened, who caused it, etc. Interesting. That's what you would say would be one of the helpful sort of magical artifacts that can aid the protagonist and sometimes has unintended consequences too, because that's plot points. So what do you think about that when the magical artifact is used as an aid or a protection, like a protection amulet or an invisibility cloak or something of that nature?
I think that that um, that highlights, I think, one of the weaknesses of fantasy storytelling, and maybe all storytelling. I don't know, but fantasy in particular, in that and uh, uh, Nathalie, Emma Romer. I am not attacking your story, so don't feel that way. But the characters are less capable without their magical things. Um, and yeah, there are occasionally stories where it's like, well, it wasn't, it was just a placebo. You were really that great hero all along. But without those things, the kids in the D&D cartoon, for example, have a harder time. They're not completely incapable, as they show in a couple episodes, but without their magical items, they are really at a huge disadvantage against the evil forces, Ventura and Tiamat, in that particular case. So I think that when they act as too much of a crutch, again, that's less interesting. I feel like when you in the story when they succeed without their or the cost of their items, like in Clash of the Titans, where Perseus gets all these cool things, but he like loses all of them by the end. And it's really his perseverance that wins out the day, and less the magical things that he used. Although they did all sacrifice themselves for a greater good, obviously.
Yeah. Honestly, I don't like that when they lose their magical items. I mean, really, are they that stupid? They
Yeah,
really hold on to these things? I mean, really? I
yeah,
mean,
especially when it's your dad. Your dad gave you your stuff, and
yeah.
then
It's
he
like
just
in
loses
the
it.
action movies where they run out of bullets and then they throw away the gun.
Right.
It's like the gun could still be used as a club, people, especially
Yes.
if it's a big old semi-automatic thing. I
Right.
mean, you can still whack people with that thing. I mean, really. And you can find more bullets maybe from the dead guys too. I mean, really. It's
Everybody's using 9 millimeter nowadays, so yeah.
so I do kind of agree with you on that when they lose their weapons. But anyway, so so I would also state that magical artifacts, especially if you're doing a quest or a thiefy thing, can create temptation possibilities. I mean, the One Ring, going back to Lord of the Rings, is an excellent example of that. And it can also help create internal conflict and the protagonists or side characters doubting themselves or maybe even switching to the dark side for a while. So, what do you think about that?
So if it exacerbates internal conflict, like the One Ring, which created conflict in the Fellowship, um, I'm okay with that, right? It's taking conflicts that exist, maybe at a low level, maybe just like the very basic resentment, and um, turning, and turning up the heat, as it were, right? But I think that if the artifact is the thing creating the conflicts all by itself, that's not as interesting of a story to me, because that is, to me, in my mind, it's the same thing as people do stupid things in horror films. And I get it. We love when somebody runs into the house instead of to their car, or whatever the trope is. Um, and that's honestly how a lot of horror, or at least some slasher stuff, that's where some of the thrill comes from, watching stupid people get beheaded or whatever. Um, but so I don't like that. I don't necessarily like that myself. I understand some people do, right? But I don't necessarily like it just creating conflict among characters who wouldn't normally have that conflict. But though when it exacerbates existing conflicts, like political ones or personal ones, um, that I'm okay with, right? Because it's like you say, that temptation. You pick me because that other person is not really worth it. You know that they're not really worth being the ones to hold me, so you hold me, and we could just leave or get rid of those other people.
Okay, so I would also say that magical artifacts, I mean, readers kind of expect them, that they create a familiarity within the fantasy. And so, what are your thoughts on that?
So that's gonna be a harder one to criticize, or deny. It is true, right? I think that people, and I'm going to slightly go on a slight rant here, but the D&Dification of fantasy writing to some degree, um, really ramped up the use of magical artifacts, and I do think that there is an audience expectation that at the very least, even if the artifact is not necessarily um, the center point of the story, that those things are going to pop up and be there and be, like you say, catalysts or crutches or um, fancy things for the characters to use. And I do think, I mean, I think that's true, right? That there's a lot of reader expectation, and so I think that's why often, like, lower fantasy, less magical stuff is a harder sell for in writing than heroic or epic fantasy, which will often include these magical items or artifacts that are expected to be there. Yeah, and I think you probably would hear, if you didn't have those things, you would probably hear about it.
Okay, so what are your thoughts about when a magical artifact is used as the catalyst for a redemption arc? Say the protagonist accidentally activates a powerful artifact that causes havoc or does something stupid while he's learning to use an artifact and someone gets killed, and then he has to deal with the guilt, he has to deal with the redemption, he has to make things right, as it were. So what are your thoughts on that?
Um, I think that there's a certain realism to that, right? Because in real life, there are not artifacts, obviously, but there are items that, firearms, for instance, can be deadly and life destroying if used improperly, even unintentionally. So there are other real life examples that you could make a case for that. And if we're tying, if if you're creating a realistic situation where the either the correct use of the artifact or the complete, the journey is the redemption is rejecting the artifact in the end, right? I think those offer interesting story types, but again, they have to be done well and without relying too much on the magical item to fix everything, right? Um, constant mistakes. The magical item is there to make things better. I don't think of that interesting in terms of storytelling and narrative. Um, but if they are used as part of the um, redemption arc, in a way that's makes sense to me, then I'm okay with that. And I think too, I think it's more interesting. Just as a note, I think it's more interesting if the protagonist or protagonists reject the artifact by the end of the story, that's part of their redemption, than it is if they somehow learn to master it, um, because it's still, that creates larger issues like addiction. Maybe, I mean, they're addicted to the artifact, but and if those aren't addressed properly in a story, then doesn't feel there's not a lot of verisimilitude um, and stuff like that.
Well, if you don't address your character flaws in any book, I think you're going to have a problem because, I mean, they have to be addressed.
I agree, 100%.
So, what do you, I would also say that magical artifacts, not necessarily even the ones, catalyst to the plot, they can also create a lot of interesting world building and lore as background to a story. So, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think the example I'm going to go back to are the silver shoes. Um, the silver shoes, what are they exactly? It doesn't even tell you in the story, right? They're never really explained. They have one power, and that's the power to take the wearer to wherever they want to go. Um, no, okay. Hi. Hello, magical artifact. Um, and which doesn't make any sense, right? If they could take the wearer wherever they want to be, surely the witch of the east could have looked up and seen the house falling around and thinking, "I do not want to be here," and teleported away. Um, so yes, they're sort of. I mean, they're sort of a catalyst, but they're easily forgotten. Like most of the story, they just don't do anything. At least the One Ring occasionally whispers dark secrets to Frodo. Um, so so yeah, I feel like it has in that case. If you're going to give me a magical artifact, I better see it, and I better see it's doing things throughout the plot, throughout the story. I want to see it making decisions or temptations, right? I think are another way that create tension and gravity on the plot. Because if they don't, then there's 100 other ways you could have used it, catalyzed the protagonist.
Okay. Okay. But to use the example from the author that shall not be named, Harry in the Harry Potter books, um, a lot of the background and the actual the world building is done with magical artifacts, like the wand shop and the sweet shop where you get the beans and all the butterbeer and whatever else. I forget what that stuff is. And even Hogwarts itself, it's all very magical, a lot of magical items floating around and stuff.
Yeah.
So I would argue that magical artifacts don't necessarily have to be central to the plot. So what are your thoughts on that?
No, but in the case of uh, that group of stories, I know it's a children's story, and apologize for language, but they be screwed without their magical artifacts, right? And I get it. In the context of that universe, um, the wizard and the witch and their broom and their tiara and their diaries are interconnected because their entire society is built upon, just like ours is built upon now, communication through things like smartphones. Theirs really is built upon. I mean, that's how you measure yourself, right? You get a bracelet or a brooch or a coat or an umbrella named after you, um, you know, and that's high prestige. Um, so yes, I think in that case it does create world building, but ultimately those things could have been accomplished, maybe not as easily, through things like memory. Through, I mean, they could have easily used a particular. Well, they do have a tree in it, but like a tree that doesn't reach out and try to eat you. Um, they could have easily had a tree that held meaning for one of the characters. They could have had a non-magical brooch that held meaning for one of the characters, and through show and through actions, they could have world built with that as well. But I think that is also, like I said, kind of an extreme example because their entire economy and social structure and personal self worth are built into these sort of adjacent magical devices.
Okay, so Joe has a thing here. Would an interesting scenario be like a conjuring of the item in a circular spell, or is it one of those that has been used to death? Now that actually brings me. Joe's been reading my notes apparently to how magical items are often used in fantasy horror, where you've got the things that have the forbidden knowledge, or you've got the items that are used to conjure the demons or the spells. So, what do you think on using it in those contexts?
Um, so uh, I think that fantasy horror and sword and sorcery, right, are very adjacent, and they can cross the streams a lot, because especially in some of the early 20th century writing. So I'm more, I admit, I'm a little bit more lenient, not the right word. Um, I have a soft place in my heart for those kind of artifacts. Um, the skull that you put in the skull of an ancient wizard, you put into your summoning circle to summon the wizard or a great demon or something like that. Um, it's hard to not smile when those tropes come up, um, or to be really against it because it's a part of a ritual, and I think that it isn't the ritual that would bother me. It's if the skull again doesn't have like it's mostly being acted upon. It's just a thing. That's not as interesting. But certainly, I mean, I admit I have a soft spot for those kind of items, especially when they're used in a summoning of that kind. But that's also. But I would also say that something like that does create better world building. Whereas, how many people can build or make a one ring? Only one person does it, but that doesn't mean other people couldn't do it, right? Whereas, there's a certain egalitarianism to the fact that with the right skull and the right raven feather and the right scorpion tail, you can bring in this slavering demon to I don't know, beat up on all your school bullies. So
Uh, I'm glad, Sean. Otherwise, we might have to change the intro to "Zero means you're dead." You summon a demon from the old world.
yes, exactly. Thank God for the old world, right? Um, so yeah. I mean, I recognize that there are aspects of the trope that are fun for sure, right? I mean, a lot of them are fun, right? It's where they get dull or overused that they really get bothersome. So
Okay, so what are your thoughts on artifacts that are used for, say, time travel or opening portals, like the Dagger of Time from Prince of Persia?
So we're getting, yeah, we're getting into,
Yeah, I'm going niche now.
yeah, no, for sure. I like that. Um, it's harder to, um, in those cases, a thing has become a focus point, right, for a particular aspect of the world, right? You can travel through time if you have this dagger, and that's really how the world works. Um, and um, I think that does have a certain degree of authentic storytelling to it, right? Um, Jack gets some magical beans, and he otherwise could not have climbed up to into the clouds. The dagger during time travel. And time travel is weird too. It's one of the places where science fiction and fantasy become that science fantasy, right? Um, and you can wink and nod, and is it technology or is it magic, and are they the same thing? Um, so yeah, I mean that is something that I have less of an issue with, because you're already dealing with the troubles of time travel as it is, right? Some people think it's impossible or absurd. So adding the need for a particular item really makes sense, right? And it does help make it does help the trope actually work better than just simply waving your fingers does. So having an artifact that could be technology or magic in that case, actually makes sense. Otherwise, I think it would fall apart, honestly.
Okay, can we all agree, though, that The Golden Child and the Ashanti Dagger gets a pass because that's just a funny movie that uses a magic artifact cleverly?
Absolutely, absolutely. Like I say, I give Stormbringer a pass as well. Um, Obviously, because I love Stormbringer. Um, but yeah, we obviously something in a greater context. If the entire story is so good, you don't really care about the shortcomings of the magical artifact. Sure, we can give that a pass.
Yeah, well, and it's the opposite. I would actually say the Maltese Falcon um, does its artifact, not magic, but its artifact badly, because the whole thing, by the end of it, it's just like, yeah,
Yeah,
I
right.
did not like the Maltese Falcon.
Right, right. Who cares about? Yeah, who cares about this? I mean, I like the movie,
Yeah,
but yeah, but the bird is really just like,
I
what are
mean,
we,
no,
what are we really talking about here, right?
yeah, it's like everyone was after this thing, and it was just a piece of junk in the end. So it was like,
Yeah,
what was the point?
right. Exactly. What was the point, right?
Okay,
And I think something like it took them a whole 6 books, 3 books, whatever, to get rid of the One Ring, but really, it wasn't that hard to get rid of it, right? If they'd been a little more clever, they could just snuck over to Mount Doom and be like, and throw it in and be like, "Oh, we're done." So yeah, so in some degrees it's the same thing, but yeah, like in the end, the Maltese Falcon wasn't anything, right? And that could be another thing where um, the build up for the magical artifact is so great during the story, but in the end, it didn't make any difference, right?
yeah.
So
Yeah, that is one thing you do have to watch out for when you're using magical artifacts, especially if it's the prize at the end of a quest, is that it better be good enough for the build-up. Yeah.
yes, right, right.
So, what about using magical artifact for foreshadowing? Do you think that's done well?
Um, I don't know. I can't think of an instance where it's been done well. Do you have one in mind? Um,
No, I was just thinking like you introduce the artifact early on in the book.
hmm.
You sort of tease that it's going to be important so that when it actually is important, that they're expecting it.
So if I like subtlety in my write when I write and when I read. So if you know um, if it's largely off stage and people are like, "Oh, that thing," we better watch about that thing. Um, and that thing lives up to itself in the end, I'm good with that. But if it's largely off stage and it's basically a dud in the end, kind of similar to what we were just talking about, I think, okay, that was a wasted. What were you wasting our time for, right? The story has to be so spectacularly good in other ways that you don't mind the fact that the artifact in the end is a dud. Um, but if it's I mean, like for it's here's an example. There's a lot that goes on with this, but like the Holy Grail lives up to its um, billing, or not the Holy Grail, excuse me, the Ark of the Covenant lives up to its billing in Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's like, oh yeah, this is it's every bit the weapon that they think it's going to be, just not. It's not going to be a weapon for the people who end up with it, right? It ends up being their destruction. Um, and so I think that's one place where even though a lot of the negatives that I point out about artifacts are true, in the end, um, it's as powerful as build, maybe more so, right, than during the movie.
Yeah, I would argue the Holy Grail does not actually live up to its hype, but
No, it's I like that movie as well, but the Holy Grail does not doesn't really do much. Yeah, it's like okay, it
yeah,
heals a few
yeah,
wounds, but sure, okay.
yeah. I added the Holy Grail to my Arthurian thing, but everybody hates it because it's just a dick. It just keeps dicking with people.
So it has personality too. Okay, maybe I'll like that Holy Grail. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like everybody. Okay, oh great, it's been triggered. We have to do another quest. It's like, yeah, like, yeah, who's gonna die this time?
Right.
Sort of. Of course, they don't actually die because they're all immortal, but that's a whole other thing. But anyway, so okay, so we're coming up in the end, so we'll get one last point here, and that is when you use a magical artifact to progress the plot, such as a mystical map, or you use it to up the stakes, like say in a fantasy sequel. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Um, um, I'm trying to think, and the Belgariad, they talk about um, that orb, and I feel like that to some degree does raise the stakes through that particular series of books. Um, Again, I think it comes down to does it live up to billing, right? If if the hype is equal to the actuality, then that will be satisfying to read. It's like, oh yeah, this thing is really this is powerful, um, and and because of that, it makes all the moves that people are making make sense. Um, then I think yes, for sure, that's fine. But if it's but getting back to what we were just saying, if it doesn't live up to that, if it's just teasing us the whole time and not in a good way, then that's not going to provide a satisfactory end for me.
Okay, so now I'm going to be a little cheeky because we've got the This Week in Indies coming up on Sunday, and we're doing maps.
Yeah.
So, what are your thoughts on magical maps?
So it's not a magical map, but the map in Time Bandits, right, that shows the location of all the various portals through time. I mean, I love magical maps. I admit, I really I love that map. I love maps in general. Um, and but maps are something that provide a great deal of utility. A map generally won't slay an enemy for you, but it might provide you location of a means to do that. So I think that the map, in general, providing some, provides world building. It does a lot of the good things that you want a magical item or a magical artifact to do. Um, and, you know, um, people are constantly interacting with it. So I think it could be front and center as well. And so that, yeah, I'm a little more sympathetic towards maps. I admit that.
Yeah, my magical map kidnapped a ship.
See, the map has agency, and I like that. I like that.
Okay, so we have a question here. Would the bracelet in The Mummy Returns fit as an answer to this question? When the child puts it on, they have to make it to the temple or he would die. Now that I would say is an example of an artifact being a catalyst. What do you think?
Sure. My big issue with that particular artifact, which is pretty cool, by the way,
Mm.
um, is the kid is dumb, right?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Like he's a very clever and I mean I'm not saying that I would not have been as dumb as the child in that. I probably would have put it on as well. Um, but from storytelling point of view, if it'd been more, if there'd been a more of a compelling reason for him to put it on, I feel like, and I understand it was going to be taken by the bad guys. I know the scene. I actually watched it recently. But if there's a more compelling reason, right, and if he known beforehand, I put this on, I have 6 days or I'll be dead. I feel like that would have made it a little bit more interesting. Like if the
Yeah.
artifact had spoken to him and said, "Hey, I can be what you need me to be, but this is the price that you might have to pay." I
Yeah.
feel like that would have made it a little bit better.
Yeah, I think they needed a little more reason there for the kid to pick it up and like have it glow or even something like that, and him just pick it up to look at it, knowing what's going on, and have the thing snap around his wrist
Yeah,
without him actually doing anything.
right. He
But
could have easily put it back in his back pocket and put his coat over it and still hidden it from the bad guys.
mm, yeah, but plot reasons.
Plot reasons. Yep. Yep. Stupid plot. Always get in
Okay,
the way.
so yeah, so I think we'll wrap the episode up here. It was a great chat, lovely debate. Thanks
Cool.
for being a guest, and I'll
Oh, thank you for having me.
let you tell everybody where they can find you and your books.
You can find my current collection, The Language of Skeptics. You go to my website, thewickedboys.com. You can also get it on Amazon, search it there. Um, and generally, that's where you can find me. I'm also on several socials as SM Hillman. And obviously, you can find me here on Sunday um, in This Week in Indies, and you can find me here doing Hit the Dice, our actual play, and Zero Means You're Dead, our interview slash RPG commentary show.
Yeah, and then we love plot reasons.
They're the
Okay.
reason, right? The reason for the season.
Yeah, and I'm your host, AF Stewart. You can find me at afstewart.ca. And I actually have a new book coming out in July, Murder, Magic, and Maple Fudge, where there are 2 magical artifacts, at least, because there's witches going around. So, and that's it for the show. So it's always time to go indie now.